enemy propaganda.
What if I told you that your own government was using your tax dollars to lie to you? How much? I'm talking about $1 billion propaganda machine now hidden in everything you see and hear. See, it all started with Operation Mockingbird when the CIA quietly paid journalists around the world to spread pro-American narratives during the Cold War.
The CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now we're looking at that very carefully.
And while the program officially ended decades ago, the blueprint never went away. Back then, they called it propaganda. But today, it's called news because you're not supposed to know it exists.
We're up against a much, actually, deeper, darker problem with this USAID scandal.
Many people think this story begins and ends with the recent USAID scandal, but that's wrong. The USAID scandal is just level 1. I'm about to break down every level of the US propaganda machine, from how the US perfected it abroad and how they quietly weaponized the same formula here. And most importantly, I'll reveal who's cashing in on all of it.
The American public will also find it pertinent and enlightening.
This is the business of influencing you with your tax dollars. So to understand why governments invest so much money in media beyond shaping reality and controlling perception, it's important to understand how they perfected a formula to never get caught. And a good way to think about this is these mattress stores. You see them everywhere, and even though you've literally never seen anyone in them, they're somehow always in business, and even when one closes, another one pops out. And just like dirty money from selling drugs need to be laundered to seem legitimate, information like corruption also need laundering too. And how it works is like a game of telephone. The narratives they want to spread along with the money is funneled from organization to organization, starting from the CIA to a local NGO, then to now even your favorite influencer like me. And by the time you hear from the mouthpiece, it's way too late. It's already passed through layers of reputable sources, and while you're scrolling on TikTok distracted from what's really happening. So when media laundering is done well, the truth isn't just hidden, it's replaced with a version so polished you never even think to question it. And the formula gets better and better the more they get away with it. But a hidden truth buried deep within the US government may have just been exposed. A secret influence operation that was spending millions to change minds. Led by Elon Musk and a mysterious group of young investigators, DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, was brought in under the Trump administration to reduce government waste. By auditing computer systems and financial records, what they found was shocking.
And this is off the Jesse Watters show. USAID, $20 million for Iraqi Sesame Street, $27 million to give gift bags to illegals, $330 million to help Afghanis grow crops. Crops.
USAID's a $40 billion deep state social justice slush fund.
So what the hell exactly is USAID? So it's very important to understand that acronym. It's USAID. It doesn't stand for USAID, but instead the United States Agency for International Development. So think about the aid as more so a fund for soft power. And like the name suggests, it was established by JFK in the 60s to promote economic development, humanitarian assistance, and democracy worldwide. So once DOGE uncovered this, 90% of USAID's funding was cut and over 1,000 employees were laid off overnight. But weird enough, so were random media outlets around the world, showing the money trail that led everywhere from Africa to Eastern Europe. And the scale of these influence campaigns shows you exactly why they made them so hard to track. And it's similar to how complicated it can get to track everything you need to run a business. But one tool that's made things smoother for me is Odoo, the sponsor of today's video. Odoo is an all-in-one business software offering applications for CRM, sales, marketing, and websites. And speaking about websites, Odoo's free website builder can set up a professional website in minutes through a simple 4-step process that lets you pick your site's goals, colors, pages, and theme. And Odoo's drag and drop builder makes it simple to customize text, images, and even animate for that dynamic look, all with no coding skills involved. Plus, Odoo's built-in AI helps generate, rephrase, or translate your content effortlessly. So use my link in the description to check out Odoo today to create a professional website in minutes for free. So now the question becomes, how far and wide were these secret influence campaigns happening and why? Because what does the US gain from shaking things up in some foreign country? Well, first thing to understand is how they made sure to not get caught. I broke this down on my X, but the key to a successful laundering operation is one thing: smoke and mirrors. And the first rule of running a secret media empire to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars while influencing millions is you don't put that shit in your business plan. Instead, what you're gonna put humanitarian aid, saving democracy, and promoting free press. Because with that, guys, now USAID, what they can do is train local journalists in foreign countries to do investigative reporting, fact-checking, and anti-disinformation efforts the USAID way. So that doesn't seem that bad, right? Because if you think about it, that's what all media does, is to form a narrative. It's literally what I'm doing right now to you. But turns out it was a lot more than just changing how people think. It was to make lasting change in key parts of the world.
Because everything moved after World War II from kinetic warfare, so we had to win elections, and we had to influence the passage of laws in foreign countries by having an apparatus inside those countries that influenced the hearts and minds of people, which influenced who they voted for, which then determined the government.
So that's Mike Benz, who was a former US State Department official, and he's done a lot of work digging into what impact these secret influence campaigns has had. And a perfect example is what he coined as the Cuban Spring.
At that time, Cuba had banned U.S. social media companies, so USAID pulled off this operation to create a company called Zunzania, which is it was a Twitter knockoff. What they did is they took humanitarian relief funds earmarked for Pakistan and they ran it through a Byzantine labyrinth of shell companies and money laundered through Cayman banks and Panamanian banks, so that it got to these Cuban businessmen to set it up so that Cuban counterintelligence would not suspect that it was a U.S. thing. Is that USAID's plan was to recruit about 100,000 Cubans onto this platform, luring them in with algorithms and vibes favoring sports, music, and hurricane updates.
So if you didn't catch that, what USAID was doing was manufacturing uprisings through a new social media site that they secretly funded and created just for this purpose. But that's not even it. It was even a lot more calculated than that.
Once they had a critical mass of users on the platform, they would then activate what they called smart mobs. They would switch the algorithms and they would selectively target news distribution of messages to users on the basis of their political proclivities in order to get them to take to the streets in violent street protests and overthrow their government. And all they needed was enough people on the user base.
And with the history between the US and Cuba, it wasn't some accident why they were shaking things up here. But this wasn't just happening in Cuba. The US was engaging in wide-scale, calculated regime changes, especially in Eastern Europe through the help of one specific NGO. Internews is a nonprofit that supports journalists to ensure unbiased and free press in regions facing censorship, such as Georgia, Serbia, and Ukraine. And there's a reason the Washington Post described them as one of the more successful agents of change. In the same time, Ukraine was also going through similar revolutions with mass protests against election fraud. And Internews, who was heavily invested in Ukraine since 1994, was instrumental in helping its partners resist censorship and political pressure. And the revolution became an absolute smashing victory for democracy, as now Ukraine became Western aligned with his new president, but what soon followed was political instability. By 2010, the formerly ousted president made a comeback and regained the presidency. And if you know about Ukraine now, there's a lot of tension. So I can't say for certain whether USAID and Internews' work in influencing elections was to actually help the people in these countries, or it was just a larger calculated effort to destabilize these countries on purpose to serve NATO expansion, defense contracts, and of course, corporate interests. But what is clear is that $470 million was spent by Internews over the last 17 years, and in their own words, their goal has always been to use broadcast media as a lever to effect social and political transformation. And if we look at what's happening in some of these foreign countries today, it's safe to say that the US has shook things up. But here's the real question. if they're pulling these levers abroad, what's stopping them from doing the same domestically? And I think the best way to understand this is by looking at how the left and the right media reacted differently to this story. Because if taxpayer funds is being used to buy influence, you would hope to hell that legacy media would be reporting on it. But what we're seeing is complete radio silence from one side, and there's a reason for that.
A lot of my Democratic colleagues and most of the members of the tofu crowd are very upset. They're screaming like Musk stole their dog or something. But one thing they're not talking about is what Mr. Musk is finding.
And frankly, it's why most of the research that you see in this video, I'm getting from X, because I always like to get as many sources for my research, but I'm not getting it. But what became clear to me though, is that this isn't even about right or left, because power changes hands all the time. But one thing is for certain, and it's that history always repeats. But this New York Times article that you're about to see completely misses that.
Hey, the New York Times wrote a profile piece on me yesterday.
And so you saw Mike Benz earlier, but what I didn't mention is that since leaving his role as the US State Department official, he founded the Foundation for Freedom Online, an organization dedicated to promoting free speech online. And as you'll hear in his response, free speech issues are not exclusive to one side.
They say co-opt to try to make it look like it's stealing the left's old talking points, rather than simply synthesizing history of what the blob did to the left in the 1960s and 70s. The CIA, the State Department, USAID, the Pentagon, they went after the anti-war left, and today it's the populist right, the anti-war right.
Remember Operation Mockingbird?
The CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
To the CIA, censorship doesn't discriminate between left or right.
The subtitle is Suspicion About Covert Operations and Soft Power used to be mostly the purview of the left. No more. Correct. Because there were hearings and accountability about what the blob did to the Democrat Party in the late 1970s. And Jimmy Carter slashed 30% of the CIA's operations division.
So it's absolutely clear to me that unless someone outside the government exposes the corruption, why would the government hold themselves accountable? But what's even more clear to me though, is that while we're being distracted that this is a right or left issue, the US is clearly launching influence operations on its own citizens. But if they are, how exactly are they getting away with it? Because just as technology of communication has evolved, so has the laws and tactics around the game of influence.
Are you familiar with the Smith-Mont Act?
Is that the 2011, 2012 thing where Obama allowed people to use propaganda against United States citizens?
Well, originally it was supposed to do the opposite. It was passed in 1948 to influence foreign audiences, not Americans, but something changed. Under Obama in 2013, the law was quietly amended where now it became allowed. So for the first time, US-funded outlets like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, meant for foreign audiences, could now legally be shared within the United States. Under this new guise of modernizing outdated restrictions in the digital age, the opposite was beginning to happen.
But the modernization got rid of the whole purpose of it, which is that we have a Smith-Mont problem for funding and operations. Our foreign policy establishment can fund groups that effectively work with prosecutors domestically, or social media censorship.
And the door was opened. I mean, look at Internews Now and how it's pivoted.
Disinformation makes money, and that's one of the, we need to follow that money.
The same NGO that was once impacting regime changes under the guise of free speech shifted its focus to galvanize ad boycotts to now control speech here. And just like that, the new guise became censoring disinformation. But you might be thinking, how can they do that without violating free speech? Well, there's always loopholes.
Yes, propaganda we've been talking about is easy to detect. But a great deal of propaganda is much more hidden, much harder to detect.
So it goes on to say, thus cutting the financial support in the ad tech space would obstruct disinformation actors from spreading messaging online. So the efforts being made to inform advertisers of the risks, such as the threat to brand safety. So this is a top-down U.S. government plan to financially re-engineer the entire economics of the news industry in order to make it so that if you spread messaging against the state or against a sensitive policy issue by the state, you are put out of business.
So before it was training individual journalists, but now they're training big tech companies to nuke ad dollars to media companies that don't obey. But how exactly were they going to coordinate this? So I hope it's easy to see now why history repeats itself. The methods might change, but the formula stays the same. As long as there's money to be made and power to gain, why change something that works? And that brings us to the most important question of this video, because who exactly profits from controlling the narrative? So obviously it's hard to say since it was intentionally designed to hide the players, but there are known ones.
The government-funded NGOs are a way to do things that would be illegal if they were the government, but are somehow made legal if it's sent to a so-called nonprofit. People cash out these nonprofits, like one of the biggest, maybe the biggest scam ever.
And how many NGOs?
In terms of large NGOs, tens of thousands.
So the obvious answer is Washington, but that's not the full story. Because so far, we've only really talked about what the US does. But what's stopping other foreign countries from doing the same thing here like we were doing in the foreign countries? And what if I told you that they've already successfully infiltrated and targeted American YouTubers just like myself? In September 2024, the Department of Justice uncovered a scheme where a Tennessee-based media company was receiving millions laundered through a complex network of shell companies. And what appeared as a regular business deal to make content turned out to be a lot more darker and calculated. 6 high-profile right-wing influencers were being paid to produce politically charged, divisive content. And when they finally found and charged 2 Russian nationals with conspiracy, investigators uncovered a hidden campaign.
A Canadian-owned social media channel that the U.S. Justice Department alleges is a key part of a Russian influence scheme is now off YouTube.
A secret influence campaign to spread hidden Russian government messaging to US audiences. And soon after, the influencers with a combined 7 million YouTube subscribers and another 7 million followers on X were revealed. High-profile names like Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Benny Johnson quickly denied any involvement, and none of the influencers were charged because instead they were listed as victims, unaware that their employer, Tenet Media, was secretly being funded by foreign interests. Since then, Tenet Media shut down, and its owners, Liam Donovan and especially Lauren Chen, has kept a really low profile online. So if our culture can be exported, why can't our influence tactics? So the real question isn't if you will be influenced, it's more so who you will be influenced by. As independent media grows and we grow in influence politically, we're also becoming more susceptible to the exact same things that we shit on legacy media for. Even with USAID defunded, one thing's for certain, and it's that the money and power to influence media ain't going nowhere. And the question of the decade is whether new media is gonna stay true to our values or live long enough to become the villain. And if I'm gonna be real, it's something I ask myself often. Because if the money was put right in front of me, neatly wrapped under the guise of free press, would I stay true or sell out too? So I guess it remains to be seen, but what I'm sure of is that you and I don't even fully understand the power of media. Because if you're still watching me right now, I've influenced you just by yapping at a camera in my apartment. And if I did it right, you probably didn't even notice. But be glad that it's me instead of this clown, right? But in all seriousness, the battle of narrative control is only beginning. And the ones who win are the ones who understand how to use this. Because when you control the narrative, you control perception. And depending on who's telling the story, you can be a freedom fighter or public enemy number 1. So if you want to see how money and power shape reality, check out this video on the hostage business.